Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. This week's guest is Aatish Taseer. Aatish is a remarkably accomplished writer whose work is fiercely debated and passionately engaged from South Asia to the United Kingdom and here at home in the States. His new book, A Return to Self, Excursions and Exile, asks us what travel means when you're not sure where home is or where it might come to be. The son of a prominent Pakistani politician and an Indian journalist, Aatish did more than carve out a life in the unlikely space in between. His struggle to understand a self becomes the construction of a different kind of self, one that resonates with both South Asia and the West. But in 2019, after an essay in Time magazine, coupled with a cover that labeled Narendra Modi India's divider-in-chief, his Overseas Citizen of India card was revoked. This is the backdrop to our conversation. He's provoked storm and ire, but the person we speak to, as you'll hear, is measured, thoughtful, and open. From a brief and unexpected war between India and Pakistan, to the global rise of populism and the fading and fragmenting of the West. If anyone could help us make sense where we're going next, it's Aatish Taseer.
Of course. Genuinely honored. I've been reading your work for a very long time, and I kind of the email was a shot in the dark to the publisher. I was really excited when we got a positive response, so it means a lot to us. Ordinarily, when we do these podcasts, we record them and then release them several weeks later, and one of the reasons we do that is because we don't want to be too framed by what's happening in the world. I think especially in the US these days, everything feels a little bit too reactionary, I suppose.
Right.
But in this case, I think the last few weeks have been pretty heavy, even by the really dense standards of the moment, that there was a brief, but I think very concerning war between India and Pakistan. And now we are, as of the time of this recording, there is an ongoing war between Israel and Iran and the United States as well. And so what I wanted to start with was a little bit about how this moment feels to you.
I was quite afraid you would ask that. You know why? Because I find myself very, not an uncertainty, but like an ability to flip between roles, you know, and one has obviously been different people at different times. And, you know, I'm somebody whose father was killed by Islamic fanaticism. I'm somebody who's been at the rough end of the Islamic Republic as a 25-year-old detained, not sure if I would get out, like, you know, really had some taste of their brutality firsthand. And at the same time, we're not in normal times in this country. And I think the sort of moral power of what used to be the West, or even the sort of desire to speak actually in a moral way, has kind of left us. And we have degraded governments in India, we have degraded governments in Israel and the United States. And so I find myself very like a kind of structural instability where I keep flipping between different roles. You know, at one point I think, well, good, like these Ayatollahs are wicked people, good for them, for America and Israel to give them a bloody nose. And there are other moments when I think like, but I mean, this is not a normal government, and they're this sort of after Gaza to go into Iran like this, and never mind the fact that the result may, if anything, strengthen the Ayatollah. So there's a real deep uncertainty for me personally.
This is a question that I feel like I don't personally struggle with, but I think in perception, you use the first person plural when referring to the West. We in the West.
Right.
And I'm not by any means disagreeing with that. I feel very much a part of the West, and I suppose it's as strange as it sounds to say I'm a Westerner, but I am. I'm an American.
Right.
I'm part of the West, and Joey and I live in the Midwest. But I feel like the way that concept is defined, it was only for a very brief moment, perhaps, that people like you and I would be included in that definition. And
Right.
The definition that appears to be gathering right now appears to be premised on exclusion. And one of the things I find fascinating in your writing, in the new book, and in previous essays and books this idea of boundaries and walls and how we construct home and what it means to be away from home, even in exile, is that the definition of West, the definition of home, is being defined in such a way that almost, I think, by default seems to exclude us.
I mean, it's a very interesting idea because right now in this country, I did a trip across America in October. I was turning this idea of Wyndham Lewis's rootless Elysium. No American worth their salt should ever come looking for roots because the greatest strength is that this country is an idea. And I thought, well, that idea is besieged now by ideas of blood and soil and a kind of a special importance given to ethnic identity and to an ethno-nationalism is very much in the air. At the same time, the idea stands. The distillation of certain principles that were part of the creation of the West as we used to know it, that still stands. So when I think of it as besieged domestically, it doesn't mean that I, as someone who grew up with these different layers of Indian history, Hindu, Muslim, then British, cannot partake in the enterprise of principles that I believe in. I have every right to do that, just as I have every right to participate in this country of English. Of course, the English language belongs to the English people and originated there, but its spread through the world, A, I was not responsible for it, and B, that it's become the language I think in, the language I operate in, the language I love. An English person can't come around tomorrow and say to me, no, hang on, it's our language, you go away. I am part of the country of English just as much as I'm part of this Western enterprise in the way that I think of it, not as an ethno-national enterprise, but a sort of enterprise of ideas that I adhere to.
It's interesting that you bring up English. That's one of the questions that I had on my mind for you. The way that I framed it was, does writing in English for you feel like it's become a sort of homeland for you? Or is, in some ways, has it been a manner in which you've made home for yourself in the use of language?
I mean, the truth is it's been the locus of tremendous anxiety for me. When I moved back to India as a young man, like 25, 26, I felt a great embarrassment. And it was not something that I was inventing. It was mutually felt. In fact, the Home Minister of India, Amit Shah, just now, a few days ago, made a statement saying, he said, in our lifetime, people will come to be ashamed of the fact that they speak only English, and that if you do not partake in the languages of India, the real India, you're in some ways a kind of outsider and an interloper. I was not immune to this feeling. A lot of my work in Urdu, firstly translating Manto, then later in Sanskrit, was a kind of like a very strenuous effort at belonging better in India. It's taken me a long time to kind of make my peace with my makeup, and English being a very important part of that. And part of the sort of tension in this book is this tension of really wanting to belong so badly and of finding one day that you're a rank outsider, and learning to kind of live with the fact that there were many rich parts of myself, my curiosity, my ability to balance different societies in my head. These things were part of the richness of my hybridity. But I really tried to set them aside for a long time in order to be, I don't know, to be more authentic.
I think that's so interesting to pose belonging and authenticity kind of against one another.
Right.
For me, just kind of from an autobiographical stance, I think this idea, this pursuit of belonging has been something that's characterized so much of what I've done in my own life. And sometimes I wonder if the idea of belonging is itself a myth, and that perhaps like the highest form of belonging that we can achieve in a meta way is this shared confession that we all are experiencing a level of loneliness, a level of isolation. I wonder what you think about that. How do you imagine belonging now? And maybe just to put a little finer point on it, is there a moment in your life where you have arrived somewhere intellectually, geographically, and said definitively, oh, now I belong here?
Firstly, that's a very, very nice question, and thank you for that. I'll give you an analogy or a sort of an answer by comparison. When this stuff happened to me where I couldn't go back to India anymore, the writer Kiran Desai, because I'd had suddenly, after loving classical Indian culture felt that it had all been appropriated by the Hindu right. And as my Sanskrit professor at Columbia once said to me, he said, the pool has been poisoned. And there was this feeling that suddenly, like, they had claimed appropriation and I had accepted that claim, and I felt that I couldn't reach into it. And this writer said to me, she said, yes, but India is still the country where you're sitting under a tree and a dog walks up to you, and that India for me is never not going to be a source of like emotion or power. And I think that part of what I've maybe experienced now is stepping away from, I think what you're talking about are more political ideas of belonging. And those can be very, very jealous masters, and they can also be extremely reductive. But there are these other ways which one should be careful not to banish from, because they're very deep, like something like hearing the azan in a town in the evening, or hearing chanting on the banks of a river in India, the face of the Buddha, of somebody like reciting something to you in a language that you thought you'd closed yourself off from, and suddenly a well of emotion comes up in you. Like, I think people should be quite careful not to sort of bar themselves to those ways of feeling that are obviously part of the texture of belonging, just because political ideas of belonging have become somewhat poisoned. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. I think that's quite beautiful, and I think it definitely resonates. Joey and I have had conversations on these notes. I mean, I've only been in the Midwest for 5 years. I grew up in New England, and when I go back, there are particular New Englandisms in language and architecture and aesthetics and assumptions that just feel really familiar.
Right.
And it's funny that I didn't realize how much of an impact that would have on me going back, until I had been away for long enough that going back, it emerged really starkly. But you mentioned Columbia. Who's your Sanskrit professor?
Actually, the head of I think it's the MESAS, the department that has become the public enemy #1 of the Trump administration. He's a man called Sheldon Pollock, one of the greatest Sanskritists of our generation.
So we're thought criminals in that department, brothers in arms in this. I was a graduate of MESAS as well, so I was just wondering. I focused on the Urdu side of it. So I took one course with, technically, I suppose I can call him Sheldon now, but that'll never feel right. Professor Pollock. But it's a good segue. So a few weeks back, Joey and I taped an episode with Steve Brusati, who is paleontologist, Chicago, Columbia trained, from the Midwest. He's a dinosaur guy. He's written a New York Times best-selling book, The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs. Initially, we got him on because, I mean, I'll confess that I still think dinosaurs are really cool and kind of interesting and something I know nothing about. So why not talk to someone who's brilliant and does interesting things, right? Out of my wheelhouse. And then as Joey and I were talking to him, it occurred to us that his wife is British, I believe, and he's been in Edinburgh for a long time. So we kind of asked him, what does the US look like to you now as an American who's left and who's now made a life for himself in Edinburgh? And he had a pretty pessimistic take on the US. And then afterwards, Joey and I were talking, and we said, are we the proverbial, is it the frogs in the boiling water, the water brought to a boil? I don't know if it's lobsters. It's some animal that gets boiled. And I'm wondering, you've experienced these kinds of narratives in Iran, in India, Pakistan, you've talked about them, you've written about them. I know this is a big question, but I feel like when you're in a place for so long, it starts to feel normal to you, and you don't know if you're actually deluding yourself or not. Like, what do you think is happening in the US right now?
Well, firstly, when I'm confronted by a liberal anxiety about this, I always joke and tell them, I said, the glories of Rome began after the destruction of the Republic, the period that we think of as the era of the great Caesars after Augustus. No, I think it takes a long time for this much law, thought, wealth, infrastructure, institutions to be undone. And obviously we have to also look at the fact that what is happening in the US is not happening in isolation. We in society after society have been witness to an old way of operating, kind of lose ground, unable to find a voice, and in response probably to a kind of a huge technological transformation for these ferocious new certainties related to ethno-nationalism, related to populism, related to immigration. All of these things come to the fore. Like, this is not a part of like an isolated American experience. It's a global experience. I think personally that if this country can't weather them, if this country can't like find a new equilibrium, I don't know really if the world can. Like, I don't know if there is somewhere else one can escape, because this is the crucible of that conversation. And to me, I think I stay very optimistic because I see the sort of waves of shock that I saw in places like India. And then I see a countervailing force, very, very powerful, very strong, groping in the dark, finding its way, finding its voice, finding the things that work politically. And I see justice, very, very uncertain, finding its feet, but starting to sort of solidify. So, maybe it's a habit of mine, but I still feel that there's something very interesting actually going on in this country at the moment, not something that one needs to give up hope on.
So I want to ask you to be my therapist for a second. Is that okay? Uh,
Sure.
all right. So
You don't know what you're getting into, Aatish. You might want to pause on that.
all right. So one of my key mentors in my life is a Lebanese guy. He came over to the States recently and gave this public talk. And we're both Christians. He has the type of faith that I aspire to. And he gave this talk and he said, so many American Christians are coming up to me as a Lebanese Christian and apologizing to me because of what this administration is doing. Stripping USAID, the ways in which the administration has been inhospitable to countries in that part of the world, and on and on and on. We know the narrative, right? And he said, you all need to stop doing that because it's becoming condescending. And what he went on to say was, that this is a moment for us to pray for and care for you all because we have been where you are now. And by that, I took him to mean they've had a corrupt government that's slow functioning, that has a lot of problems in it. And the thing that surprised me when he said that was how defensive I got
Yeah.
by his statement. And I remember thinking in my head, yeah, it's bad, but it's not that bad though. And so I wonder what's going on for me there. Give me a little diagnosis. Like what's
So
going on for me?
I actually, it's a very, very, it's very interesting that tension. So one of the epigrams for this book is from the writer V.S. Naipaul, and it goes like, to awaken to history was to cease to live instinctively, and it was to see oneself as others saw you, like, and it was to know a kind of rage. And he was writing in reference to India in the 1980s. But a lot of the tension in this book, for instance, is the tension of gaze. And for a long time, people on the outside, people in sort of the old non-West, felt seen, that felt violent. They felt like, no, 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 hang on, that's not who we are. That's not right. And they suffered with that anger. But for many years now, for at least in the last 20 years, that movement has been going the other way too. And I think that in America, for instance, there is an incredibly instinctive way of doing things and an incredibly powerful feeling of defining narrative, of not necessarily being seen. And obviously, in the advent of Trump, one has almost a caricature of the American that people had in their minds all along. Accompanying that, the emergence of that caricature is, I think, for many Americans, the experience of being seen in ways that they didn't intend to, of a kind of something like a little bit hostile. And we were talking earlier about what was going on, and that is part of what's going on. I think that is part of this fierce feeling of needing to go to ground, of historical nostalgia, of wanting to bar up the doors, is to escape the gaze of other people.
So I have a follow-up here, and now I'll just make the really weird argument because why not? So when I moved here 5 years ago, I came out of a very bi-coastal American Muslim identity, forged very much in the post-September 11th environment where American Muslims were allegedly reflexively Democrats, and whatever our critiques of the system and the state might have been, we believed that, or at least this cohort of people believed that change would and could come. I think Obama symbolized that, and especially the first term is kind of hope and change narrative, pluralistic democracy, all of that. Then I come to Cincinnati 5 years ago, and I'm genuinely shocked to find, and I'd since found this repeated in many other encounters across the U.S., that in a lot of these communities with a lot of recent immigrants, there was a lot more support for Trump and the right than I had presumed even possible. And I think
Right.
I think obviously after October 7th and the Gaza war, it's kind of hard to know how that would have panned out. But I I just guess as a hunch that probably half the people I was interacting with in that space would have voted for Trump had it not been for how, Gaza kind of changed the conversation, right? And it's hard for me to say this because I'm a brown guy named Haroon in America. But I feel like a lot of times Trump, although his solution may be entirely off, insincere, instrumental, opportunistic, what have you, he often identifies real problems that liberals were not willing to face up to. Joe Biden was really old and probably not entirely all there, in the last year or two of his term. It is true. I mean, now the irony of saying this after the last week, but it is true that Americans were spending a lot of money on foreign wars with unclear outcomes and I think in many cases faulty premises.
Right.
And I think in a lot of cases, these movements do identify or pick on real problems. Now, the solution may be the wrong one, right? Just because America can't be the world's policeman doesn't mean, as you put it, America can go it alone, right? Like I think there's a lot of room between those two positions, right? That we could try to accommodate. I guess I'm wondering is, do you think that it's the case that this wave of populism is emerging because a lot of people in positions of power fail to address problems, or is there something more atavistic in place that might even be inescapable and inevitable, just part of human nature, that we're always going to have a desire for deep roots and ethnic community, and we can temper it, but we can't ever silence it or eliminate it, if that makes sense. On a collective level, maybe not personally, but just on a collective level.
There are a lot of interesting strands in this question. I think that firstly that to address that, is it David Brooks? I'm not sure who describes him as the wrong answer to the right question, Trump, that is. I think that these categories that we have, whether we like it or not, there is nothing more dull and more unsexy today than the mainstream of the Democratic Party. The mainstream of the Republican Party has all but collapsed. We're seeing crazy, a coalescing, especially during this recent situation in Iran, between the very far left in this country and the MAGA right. And we have I remember my sister, I almost drove off the highway when she said this was before the election. She's like, well, if our money is going towards foreign wars, well, then we should be paying fewer taxes and we should be voting for Trump. And I was like, something is dangerously wrong in this logic. But I think she was reflecting a kind of movement on the ground. The second part of your question, I want you to rephrase it a little bit for me. What do you mean when you say that an inability, is it something about feeling assaulted by internationalism and wanting smaller, more ethnic ideas of belonging and roots and something more manageable? Is that what you were asking?
I think that's correct. So if I can rephrase it, I guess what I would say is, and I don't mean it necessarily has to be reduced to ethnicity, blood and soil nationalism, although that's often the form it can take. But I wonder if there's just a part of the human psyche, and obviously we're not uniform, we're individuals, so people are different. What I'm comfortable with, someone else might not be. That at some level, on a kind of collective level, we instinctively want to be part of groups and tribes and communities, and these can only be of a certain scale and of a certain ambition.
Right.
And when they get too big, whether they become unwieldy, impersonal, I don't know what it is. And I think maybe the hardest version of the question is at some level a truly pluralistic, multiracial democracy? Like you said, America is a crucible. Is it impossible? And again, I'm saying this as, a brown guy, ancestrally Pakistani Muslim. I'm not saying this in some sort of triumphalist sense. I'm saying this in a sense of, are perhaps the aspirations of a lot of people who might have lined up behind Obama and a certain vision of America maybe just unrealistic? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Right. So I think a couple of things here. One is that I think that the impulse you're identifying is real, but it's also an illusion, because once that wholeness that we're talking about has been shattered, once the gaze of other people has been assimilated, or even once you're aware of it, there's no returning back to status quo ante. There's no world in which one can regain that, because God knows we've tried in so many communities, and almost every time that nostalgia has taken political form, it has also taken violent form. So there's no world in which the protections of not being seen by others, of not being part of an international community, all of that can be rolled back, and you can be whole again and intact. The day that one single foreigner stepped onto the soil of the North American continent or into Africa or into India, that was broken for those places forever. And similarly, if there is a countervailing force, if people here now feel seen in ways they don't want to be seen in, they can't roll any of it back. So you're in a sense like if you are submitting to that nostalgia, if you are trying to create these imaginary worlds in which the outside world doesn't exist, you are engaging in a kind of fantasy. The second point, there's a great richness here, and I remember feeling it. I was on this crazy trip across America because I'm no great driver, and I was driving for the first time Chicago to LA, and in the town of Foss, Oklahoma, I encountered like a Punjabi dhaba, like Preet Ka Dhaba, and there was some boys from like Gurdaspur in Punjab, and they had come to make a life in America. And that world of hyphenated identity, of being very comfortable in being sick, being who you are, and also being American, that sort of the elasticity, I guess, of the American frame of belonging, it may be damaged, but I don't think that there is an alternative because, on one hand, that is such a powerful aspect of this country. It's such an alluring aspect for other people because, in most other societies, there isn't a route to belonging. You can't get there. Or there is a route to belonging that requires the utter obliteration of your own ideas of ethnicity, of religion, of all of those things. And America, until now, has had this very rich way of being kind of at once part of the macro, as well as like something very rich, small, something that takes religion seriously, that takes ethnicity seriously. Yeah, I mean, it would be devastating if that was lost, but I don't think it will be.
This episode is brought to you by Queen City Diwan. We build experiences, adventures, and retreats for travelers of all ages and backgrounds. We design journeys so you can take friends and family and make friends and family, because we believe who you travel with and who you become along the way matters just as much as where you go. This September, we'll be in Uzbekistan. In October, we're leading a remarkable pilgrimage across Saudi Arabia. And in January, we're offering a leadership retreat exclusively for college students, a journey across Andalusia, helping students connect with their heritage, discover their purpose, and realize their incredible potential. Visit queencitydiwan.com to find out how you can join an unforgettable adventure with me, your co-host, Haroon.
I love the idea of a route to belonging. Like, that's title worthy. I love that so much. So I have something's going on in my head here, and tell me if this doesn't make any sense, but it seems to me like you're a totem for the hybridity of multicultural democracy. Okay. And there's a way in which I think a lot of your writing is this attempt to find coherence between these different identities, right? Tell me if I'm totally off base there, but that's
no.
So I wonder if there is a lesson in that pursuit that you have had personally for us as a nation. And what I mean by that is there a way in which, you say it's lost, there's no going back, but is there a way that we could construct a meta narrative, a meta myth that provides some coherence to these different aspects of the American identity?
I think the problem I'm having is my own journey is so much the journey of a creative person, of an individual, with a huge, huge importance placed on intellectuality. And to me, the intellectual and the creative and the artistic, like those are places where, those are repositories where contradiction can live. It's almost like the joy of being like in an airport hotel or a boarding lounge where like you are in a liminal space, you are in a world of in-betweenness, but you're not uncomfortable. You're able to balance these different things. You're not trying to force cohesion. You're not trying to force an answer. You're just letting these different contradictory ideas kind of vibrate next to each other. That's a very, very important state to be in. It's like a creative state. But how does one take something like that and broadcast it nationally? Nationally, everyone wants an answer. Everyone wants a prayer. Everyone wants a credo. Everyone wants a flag. So I don't know if I can square those two things.
I'm juxtaposing, you said you almost drove the car off the highway when your sister said what she said. Then you told us you're not a very good driver. So I don't know if If that, I don't know what you were trying to tell us there, but I'm sure you're a
Really
good driver. I'm sure you're a good driver.
I
'Cause,
haven't driven into oncoming traffic yet.
I mean, Chicago to LA is no mean feat. It's a big country. Um, what did you say to your sister?
I mean, it was just completely, I was appalled. It's actually a huge grief for me because my sister and I were really both like our relationship was a kind of triumph of overcoming the pull of religious national identities. And we are like all but not speaking after Gaza, after India, Pakistan. And I feel like a great sadness. I feel like I've really failed in a sense because I was like, well, if you can't succeed on this level, on the level of your own sort of inner circle, your house, your family, then like, who are you to talk about it in a bigger way?
So here's a question. Does she live in the United States? I'm assuming.
She was living here at the time, and she's subsequently she's been in Lahore more recently.
I have a sort of a strange thought keeps occurring to me when I encounter Muslims who are very far right, maybe not so much far left in the American context, because far left, I suppose, is not surprising given some of the foreign policy commitments. Far right does occasionally seem surprising. And I wonder if it is not, in a perverse way, and I'm not saying this in a kind of self-satisfied way, a testament to the success of the American idea, that one can feel so American that even as someone who's frequently perceived as an outsider, as marginal, even as threatening, one nevertheless still feels like one has the right to be part of the far right movement, right? That it's almost absurd. It sounds like a Dave Chappelle skit, and yet I don't know if there's necessarily room on the far right in the minds of many of the people on the far right, but I found this kind of gravitating to this, I guess, deconstruction or reconstruction of American identity. And the reason I'm drawing that point is that what you said about living with tension, liminality, the airport lounge, it's a really potent and powerful image. I feel that all the time now, right? Like my neighbors, who I have very polite, sometimes very warm conversations with, are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum politically. I'll go to the mosque and talk to people who have opinions that I'm sometimes just really surprised by. And I'm sure my opinions, frankly, surprise them.
Right.
And I don't know, is that to, I guess, to take off from Joey's point, is there a level of, what's the word? Is it impossible? Are we living in a fantasy that that the polity is deteriorating, or is it really possible?
So I think the polity is changing in very dramatic ways. I feel that I'll give you an example again. My husband's family are from Tennessee and very much evangelical South, very religious. And one of the things that used to be very striking to me was that we talked in highly politicized ways in the city. And we would like meet each other, and the first thing would be like, who have you voted for? And what about this and this latest outrage? And then one would go among my husband's family, and they were obviously had voted Republican, voted for Trump, and they were not talking in those ways. They were asking about, how your day had been, what the drive was like, and what sort of sports was probably the most contentious locus of activity that was brought up. And I was like, it's very important, I think, to understand these different ways of being. But I feel of late that maybe a change is occurring on the other side too, because one of the things that I noticed with the traveling was that like it was often the case that in America you were almost never asked a political question by a stranger. And I kind of felt that that had started to change on the other side too. And there was this one moment, very striking, very small, but we were at the Grand Canyon. Can you imagine, like, what better metaphor could you have for a chasm? And this lady was taking a picture of some Korean tourist, and I didn't even notice it, but some guy walking by said to her, he's like, "Man, I like your cap." And it was suddenly there was a flash of red, and I saw it was a MAGA cap. She said, "Yeah, Trump all the way," because otherwise, God knows, there was this kind of feeling that politics had become existential, which, like, this country, Britain, it had always felt to me that politics had almost been a form of entertainment, a sideshow. It had never had this quality of the urgency it has, for instance, in France or all over South Asia, where at any moment you can ask a taxi driver, you can ask him about politics, and you jump right in. And so I think we are seeing an extreme politicization of parts of this country that perhaps had not known this way of conversing in the past.
I'm just reflecting a little bit. I think My question before was, what does it look like to use your own experience to create a meta narrative? And I'm thinking now, as I hear you talk about your in-laws, maybe that's the wrong headed pursuit. Maybe it should be the opposite way. Maybe we, instead of trying to find a monomyth, trying to homogenize, find one story, we should actually be differentiating parts of people into many different elements. And if maybe the impulse to have one coherent kind of story is actually part of the problem. Any reflections on that?
I think whether you like it or not, this is a country that deals in very powerful myths, and word of those myths or the reality of those myths or whatever has spread like far and wide. I think that however one may think about the present government, the idea of America is something that exerts a very, very powerful force. And those things are not undone in 4 and 8 years. I will say there is like a historical evasiveness sometimes. And again, it's weird, I keep referencing this trip, but like it came up for me a lot in relation to, I was among Native American communities in New Mexico and then later speaking to an artist, and she was talking about, for instance, certain myths in which, like the cowboy Indian myth, where the people watching the film are making common cause with the cowboy, even though obviously the Native American is so clearly the person besieged by a kind of violent force from the outside. And it gave me this weird feeling. I was like, well, there's a myth, or there's a sort of way of dealing with what must have been pretty convulsive history in a very trivial way. And if you contrast that with something like the meeting of what Baldwin would describe as the meeting of black and white on the North American continent, that great interracial drama, that is something that could not be simplified into something as trivial as cowboys and Indians. That's something that like people may have tried at different points, but that is like roiling, difficult history. And so the reason I bring these things up is because I think that there is a tendency in this country sometimes to be afraid of discomfort, especially historical discomfort. And I think that is a very dangerous tendency. That is something that like to want to will away. Because, the conceit of the place was that you weren't bogged down by the past, that you could look to the future. And it was always something that every visitor and every writer remarked upon, this feeling, the kind of bright, forward-looking movement of America. And what a shame it would be if there was a kind of nodal point in history that sort of prevented the country from getting ahead in the same way that so many of our countries, whether it's Mexico, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan, don't feel they have a future unless they can resolve the wounds of the past.
That point really hits me because one of the things I do, I run a travel company and I build historical tours, heritage tours, things like that. And you have a chapter in the book where you talk about Andalusia and you're traveling through the south of Spain. And there's this moment where you talk about not just the layers of history, but how returning to a place reveals layers that accrue in ourselves. And the reason I found that really powerful and beautiful is the first time I went to Andalus, I led a tour there. I was a grad student. I was at Columbia, and I realized that taking rich people on vacation and explaining things to them was a great way to make money. And also, then I got to stay in the hotels they stayed in, right? Because why wouldn't I be with the tour group? So it was nice, right? Why not? So the first time I did that was about 16 years ago, and now I have a whole company that does it, and it's a totally different time. And I remember the first time I went to the south of Spain. And it was like I felt shatteringly sad, as if the expulsion of the Muslim population of Andalus had happened to me personally or to my family members, right? And now when I go back, and maybe it's because I've just been back so many times, I don't know, I don't quite feel sad. I think I have a different emotion. It's kind of, this was an incredibly complex society with good and bad. They built some beautiful things. They did some terrible things. Some terrible things happened to them. And now the way I frame it is, and the way I frame it to the people who go with me, because I, like you, I don't like nostalgia as a narrative. I think it's dangerous, it's reductive, it can become harmful, is they got to do really cool things in some cases. What do you want to do? Right? Like, how does this speak to your identity, your experience of the world? Does it enrich it? Does it complicate it? Does it nuance it? Whatever it might do, what do you want to do with this? And I think that ability to move from a narrative that sees loss and pain and hurt in almost personal terms to this is part of the human story, the human experience. I think to me, it sounds like you're saying is we need to go from the former to the latter. But I'm wondering how we do that.
That parable of Andalusia is probably one of the richest, most interesting, endlessly rewarding historical parables in the world because you have this symmetry, you have this Muslim conquest, you have a period of very, very fanatical Muslim rule, and then you have a period of great syncretism. And then that syncretism is mirrored on the Christian side and results in a fanatical Christian regime that does not merely damage its prospects in Andalusia, but when it comes to the New World, it is still seeded with that fanaticism that was required to expel the Muslims. It was one of the most incredible examples of how nobody gets free of history, not just the victim, but the perpetrator is completely bears the weight of this and can be destroyed by it just as easily as the person who was to be the victim. This business of like the how of it, which is what you're asking me, is I don't think that it's the job of somebody looking at history or trying to understand it to try to be getting from point A to point B. I think that historical evasiveness is dangerous because of what it hides. And so this business of probing, of looking squarely at the past, is in a sense, in my view, all that needs to be done. That idea of seeing the past as past is already in some ways to be free of it. You know, there's this wonderful line, I think, in one of the Naipaul books where he says, the past must be seen to be dead or the past will kill. So like, we're not trying to steer anything anyway. We're just trying to make sure that we're not hiding.
We're not hiding. Yeah, I'm with you. I love that so much. I got another big question for you, just for you to ponder on philosophically. That's what you're here for, right? So you've just had such amazing, incredible experiences all across the globe. And some of the early work was connected to your father and his heritage. I wonder now, as you think about your journeys, as you think about the pilgrimages that you're taking, even maybe across the states, how do you think about what you're seeking or what you're searching for? Is it a place, a person, a principle, something else?
So I'll give you a nice example from the pilgrimage section is that here is a really, really concrete example of how I try to get away from systems of thought. Pilgrimage is a religious journey. It's a journey in which you're meant to feel something. It's a journey in which you're meant to have a moment of inner contemplation as you're moving across space and time to a locus of devotion and prayer. I was a man without faith, coming among people who were embarking upon a journey of faith, now to Karbala, now to the Lake Titicaca, now to the different shrines in Mongolia. And it was very hard for me because my first trip ever had been as a non-believer to Mecca, and I'd been left with this terrible sense of masquerade, of pretending that I was something I was not. And I thought, like, here I am doing this again, aren't I? Like, how do I enter this? And then at one point, very early on in Bolivia, this young man who's a musician talked about how his father had taken him on the pilgrimage, and the father had died during the pandemic with COVID-related causes. And he was embarking on this journey now where he was going to play music in the basilica in memory of his father, but it was a completely quiet. He was doing the pilgrimage for himself in memory of his father, and he would honor his father's memory by playing this very beautiful Baroque music in the cathedral or the basilica. And to me, I thought, like, that is me. That's where I come in. That's that human element of which I deal with as a writer in every way, of then also managing narrative in that sense of being able to tell that story of it. And suddenly I felt completely alive. And I felt I was not a fraud. And I felt I was completely able to be part of this journey with the quiet reserve that I have of being without faith, but of being able to enter it in my own way. And that to me felt very, very important.
Can I read a part of your book that I'd like you to respond to about pilgrimage? Just a couple of sentences here. It says, to me, this is your own words, to me, pilgrimage was one of the great metaphors for the ties that bind and those we are prepared to shrug off. It replicated an atmosphere of exile since it invariably took place in an unfamiliar setting, a place away from home, even as it brought nearer the indestructible idea of home and belonging that we each carry within us. How does that hit you now as you hear those words in light of the conversation we're having?
I think it's good. I think it's right.
Me too. I love it.
I know normally when I hear something like that, I have my heart in my mouth. So writer is going to mess up.
This idea of pilgrimage being a metaphor for the ties that bind us and those that we're prepared to shrug off, and the action of having to go somewhere else to honor that bounding, that just feels incredibly compelling to me.
Yeah, it's very moving to encounter it on the ground, whether it's my husband's grandmother who's 97 and she probably never left the four-state area of Texas, Alabama, Georgia. And basically, like the one time she'd been abroad was to go to the Holy Land. And you meet people like that all over the Muslim world who've never even been to the big city next door. And they go to Makkah and they perform the rite. We associate travel so much with a kind of cosmopolitanism, with the sort of tourist industry, with a way of kind of being, you're the world traveler, you've gone and seen the world. And then there's all the while this quiet story, centuries old, of people leaving home with all the dangers that used to attend that sort of journey and making this very, very profound religious journey to a place of devotion. It's a sort of one of those moments where you realize that something that feels very new is in fact very old.
When you mentioned the story of the Punjabi family in Oklahoma, I kind of smiled to myself because I'm 45, turned 45 last week. Doctor's office sent me the notice to get my first colonoscopy, which was literally the first birthday present I got that day. So it was a nice reminder of the
happy birthday.
Thank you. I can still remember from talking to my parents, for example, or their siblings, their experience of being South Asian. I won't even say necessarily Pakistani or Indian, because frankly, when both of my parents were born, there was neither a Pakistan or an India as we know them today.
Right.
And now with our kids, they have an entirely different experience of Desiness. And for lack of a better term, I don't even know what to call it. I remember we were in the car, one of our daughters and her friend who just come back from Western Europe vacation, and they were talking, and I learned very early on that when your teenagers are talking, never interrupt, because you get a lot more information from just pretending you're not there, because they'll quickly forget you exist. So it's a good exercise. And my daughter asked, what was it like? And she mentioned she ate at some Indian or Pakistani restaurant. And, my daughter said, well, what are the Indians and Pakistanis like over there? And she said, oh, they're really poor. And I thought it was a really like odd moment, because I thought to myself, oh, in their worldview, everyone who's Indian or Pakistani is a doctor or an engineer. And the kind of post-colonial narrative that I grew up surrounded by just doesn't exist, because not that it doesn't exist, but it's just a very different reality that a lot of generations struggled and sacrificed to reach a point where someone like yourself, for example, can be a voice and a writer who's consumed and appreciated and engaged by all kinds of different people. And that is unusual in the sense that historically, right, there was not a lot of room for people who didn't fit into certain boxes, even just a few generations, even a generation ago, I would argue. Right. And so the reason I'm saying that is I think that we've come a long way. We've seen new perspectives, new ideas, new voices, and God willing, there is no going back, like you said. I'm wondering if you can share with us your experience of that world, of being a writer and moving in spaces where maybe your voice, literally your complexion, would not have been seen or accepted or acknowledged 20, 30 years ago. Maybe even to some extent now. I don't know, but I wonder what that's like.
I feel like I have so many experiences of, again, like where that Naipaul line comes up of the determination touched with fear to remain who and what I was, which is to say that one is in a background that assumes you or consumes you, or like you disappear into it. Pakistan for me was my first experience of that. And I remember being at the border and they saw me and they made racial judgments. They made judgments based on my name. And they thought, here is someone with a British passport who is essentially Pakistani returning home. And I remember at one point they asked me, they said, why are you coming? So I said, I'm coming here for my mother's birthday. The word I used for birthday was Janamdin, which is a word that would only have been used in India. And this dead silence kind of falls over the room, and this man from the back says, Salgira. And suddenly I was like a German spy who didn't know a nursery rhyme, found out, exposed. And to me, that was like it was a very early experience in that sense of like, of course, there's this wish to travel unmolested, but just as dangerous or pernicious is that possibility becomes something you aren't based on the way you look or seem. And later, in a funny way, sexuality was a great metaphor for me of that kind. I remember like being in Uzbekistan, and my guide was like just like constantly talking about those faggots and this and that, like really virulently like homophobic. And you're in an age of Instagram, people like you share your identity. There's like a picture of like you kissing your husband. And like when I got home, and I shut my whatever account, when I got home, we posted some picture and he just wrote under this thing, he's like gays with a question mark, like spelled Geys. And like he wanted to have it out with me to know like how I had come as a kind of the writer as a sort of like a secret agent, an intruder, somebody who's seeming one way. And it took me very much back to that first experience of Pakistan, because what everyone said to me when I wrote my book was they said, you came among us like a spy, like you seemed like someone who we could trust, and now you've written all these things. And I felt even at the age of 25 very clear that my prerogative to my inner life as a writer was very, very important and sacrosanct, but it was this tension of either on one hand being found out or disappearing into the background in a way that makes people suspicious later.
That challenge of, yeah, that hits me. I think that's always a question for me is how much can you share? And I think also how much do people assume? And I think that's part of the challenge.
Right.
And I do wonder about that a lot. I think in religious spaces, for example, as an example, I think that sometimes I'm caught between the act of when I'm speaking confessionally and then when I'm speaking descriptively. And I don't know that people will always recognize the distinction that if I'm teaching a class in a secular institution, it's very different than if I'm teaching a class in a religious institution.
Right.
I wanted to pivot from there very awkwardly with no segue whatsoever, but it is still germane to the conversation. One of the things I've always loved about South Asia, India, Pakistan, the broader region is the incredible richness of the culture, music, art of all kinds, poetry, fashion, design. It's an incredible place. And there are so many voices that are receiving global recognition. So here in Cincinnati, actually, at our art museum, which is a very nice museum, actually had a show, an exhibition of Shazia Sekunder's work.
Oh,
And I
amazing.
remember how it was surreal, right? It was shortly after Trump was elected, and they had an opening, and hundreds of people came from all different backgrounds, from all different parts of Cincinnati. And it was really something beautiful. And I remember telling my wife, and we helped put the show together. We had our names on it. And she was saying, this is really unreal because I came here as a child and I never thought we would see this kind of artist, this kind of art in this museum, but it was real and people were loving it, appreciating it, engaged by it. Long story short, who are you reading or listening to or inspired by, or do you think that more people should be paying attention to? Because I think it's still a world that, for all its efflorescence and uniqueness, sometimes doesn't get the recognition it deserves.
Oh, I'm going to disappoint you. I've also been in a process of strange kind of recoil where I spent so much time reading within a South Asian context and reading across languages. After the sort of pushback of these last 4 or 5 years, I've just been like very free of that sort of thing, of not necessarily like reading along lines of interest, reading along obviously the places that I've traveled to, but not in that vein.
So then what are you reading if you don't mind sharing? I'm just curious.
Actually, I'm reading a book that speaks to me very directly. It's a book called Proto, which is about the Indo-European family of languages and about the sort of connections that existed between that kind of vanished world. And to me, it was very, very important because we began talking about my anxiety with language. And one of the ways that I found I overcame that was in learning Sanskrit I realized that it was the first expression of this shared Indo-European history. And obviously, like, there was suddenly this feeling that, like, I had assigned all this value to Greece, to Rome, to English, and I'd secretly denigrated what had been part of, in the compass of my history, of my linguistic history, what was a living part of my linguistic history. And suddenly this experience of coming to Sanskrit in this totally roundabout way. And again, here, this is not a nostalgic journey. It's not a journey like the boarding pass or the road to Sanskrit for me led via the West. But it was also like an acknowledgement of this kind of deeper bedrock of shared roots that made me able to reach into English again more easily.
Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I have one more question for you. It's another biggie. One of the topics that Haroon and I are very interested in is this idea of masculinity, especially kind of from our social locations. As a man who's been shaped by so many experiences, countries, cultures, how do you understand masculinity in this moment?
It's a very funny thing because we were talking earlier about that feeling of the writer as secret agent. Well, I think probably a lot of gay men have lived with this experience of coming into false pretenses within different communities. And I was very late, not that late coming out, but fairly late, and dated women and had these different sort of experiences of South Asian masculinity, which was very, like, on one level, it's a perfect example of that kind of, you can get a very warm welcome and it's very effusive. And at the same time, like, I can't deny that the particular politics right now we're seeing in India is a politics that has a very obviously masculine edge, just as the way like Trumpism here has that side. I guess on a very personal level, I feel like conflicted between like an incredible amount of tenderness that I've felt within very male atmospheres and that I still feel like, and of not maybe being able to catch the moment where that what is small and human and micro is being converted into grievance and ideology. I don't know if I still know where that particular sort of point of conversion is. But again, this phenomena of, I mean, a very patriarchal society like India, there's a guy, a YouTuber who's a very close friend of mine, who feels completely on the back foot and is very much part of the world of Joe Rogan and of a sort of the aggressively like bro-y, desi version of like that culture and of wanting to sort of sock it back to this world of effete cosmopolitans and women and foreigners and people who've like made him feel ashamed. So like it's quite hard for me to enter into. I'm sorry for this very incoherent answer, but it's not something I really like that I've really been able to reach the bottom of.
I honestly think that's exactly why we're having the conversation. That's why we're interested in it, because I think the conversation around it, the rhetoric around it is so incredibly limited and kind of captured by this one very particular imagination in our country and obviously South Asia as well.
There's something from James Baldwin. It's his last interview, or one of his last interviews, where he finally gets around to talking about sexuality. And it was very, very important to me because it was something that I had always felt was secondary. I'd felt like India was going through this big cultural convulsion, and I couldn't make myself more marginal by being in this sort of like sexual category that seemed like a kind of indulgence of the West. And Baldwin had felt very much like that in an American context. And then he comes to this point where he says, like the same need that invented a figure like me and labeled it with the N-word, that same culture, that same need would have invented the faggot. And he sort of closes the gap between that, like saying that obviously for him, race would always come first because it was something that like, it was part of what the people he'd grown up with faced every day. That the creation of these categories was coming from the same place. And so I offer that to you not as an answer, but rather as like a way of looking at what's occurring in masculinity today.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking. And and who else we should be talking to. Next episode, we'll be talking to Peter Block about aging and death.